Scripture reading is from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 13. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. And you shall not murder. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Ruth. If you've been with us, we've been going through the book of Exodus and tracking with the wilderness journey of the Israelites after God has freed them under the hand of Pharaoh from slavery. And now we've been parked at the Ten Commandments, the giving of the law that God gives to his people to say, this is the law of love. This is the way now you're going to be truly free to live the kind of life that you were always meant for. I think it's really important and helpful for us to track through each and every one of these 10 commandments because we're living in a world today where we are desperate for guidance. We don't know what kind of a life is going to help us to most flourish. We're looking anywhere and everywhere for any kind of guidance, and God says, I got it for you. This is the way. These are the moral sort of guardrails that you are to build your life on in order for you to most flourish. And so now we've come to the sixth commandment. And over the past couple of weeks, I'm sure that you've had different moments throughout the past couple of weeks if you've been here. And you ask, this is like the 10 things, right, that God is calling us to do. God, like, why in the world would it be so important to keep Sabbath rest, or to not make any graven images, or like we looked at last week, why is it so important to honor your parents that it would make it into your moral law? Well, we come today, and you hear God saying, you shall not murder, and you say, okay, I understand this one. This one makes sense to me. If this maybe even should have been first on the list of the 10 commandments, the way that we are supposed to live. This is not controversial at all. But today we have to ask why. Why is that actually the case? Why is this not controversial at all? But also you might be thinking, this is also the first one that I have not violated for most of us. So you're finally feeling a little bit of relief. I'm 1 for 6. I'm doing pretty well. At 16%, you be the judge. I don't think that's doing pretty well. But this is also the one that we also think, I haven't violated this one. I haven't murdered anybody. But we're also going to see, like we've seen in all the other 10 commandments, that there's so much more to it. And so we'll look at how we actually do violate this as well. So let's look at 3 things this morning on the 6th commandment. Let's look at why it's wrong, how we break it, and how we can keep it. Why it's wrong, how we break it, and how we can keep it. So first, let's start with sort of parsing out an understanding of what God is actually commanding here. The command here is not about killing in general. You may have heard some translations that says, thou shalt not kill. But in fact, the Hebrew word that's being used here is ratzah, which is not sort of a just killing or in the context of war or a punishment, but it's all about the unauthorized taking of life, a willful taking of life of somebody else's life, which is why the NIV, our translation that we read, translates it not as you shall not kill, but to put some intent and force behind it, it says you shall not murder. Now, all of us, of course, we would say murder is wrong. Categorically, murder is wrong. But my question this morning is have you really thought about why? What is the reason why it is so obvious to us that this is a heinous crime and it should be punished? And I ask that because I don't think a lot of us have thought deeply about it. In fact, today, there is a problem of morality in our secular world. Right? We are very confused as to why we should do something or not, and partly because the way that we come up with our own morality is by self-choice. We have a self-authorizing view as to the moral commitments that we are taking on. And therefore, you say, well, I'm going to take these on and I'm not going to impose them on anybody else. In fact, we typically don't like it when we live into a cultural narrative that says, this is how you're supposed to act. You say, well, you do you and I'm going to do me. But therefore, here's what Charles Taylor says, who's a Canadian philosopher that's written a lot about this stuff on sort of the self-authoring view of our morality. He says, moral positions today are not in any way grounded in reason or the nature of things, but are ultimately just adopted by each of us because we find ourselves drawn to them. Maybe you sense that in yourself, right? What is your sense of right and wrong? How do you come up with that? A lot of us are just drawn to a lot of them. And here's the issue with that. When that is the case, you have to realize that there is no moral obligation to uphold any of those moral truths. It is always just a matter of personal preference if your moral source is coming from the individual or just coming from yourself. And you might say, well, fine, but not with things like murder. You say murder is very obvious. It is self-evident. Or you say murder, it just feels so wrong. And you move toward your personal intuitions. And I'm just here to say, those reasons are not good enough as to why this is wrong. Because the question becomes, says who? You are now imposing your beliefs onto somebody else. Somebody else in a different time and place can say, well, why can't we just be like nature with the strong eat the weak? And in fact, lots of different times and places throughout history have lived into that. Says who? And that doesn't sit well with us, right? Because you say, how could you actually say murder is okay? And that doesn't sit well with us because we also live in a world today that not only has this relative view of morality, but we also live with very, very strong convictions toward moral truths. We are so pro-human life. We are so pro-justice. We insist as if these things are self-evident to other people, and we want to impose them onto others. And so, in theory, we are relativists when it comes to what's right and wrong and morality, but in practice, we are absolutists. We impose it on folks all the time. And you see, without a higher moral authority outside of yourself, this is what will always happen. There is no real reason to say that you shall not murder, that it is categorically wrong. Because you can't make it an obligation. It's ultimately only a preference, and it's usually based off of the cultural streams and the cultural narratives that we live in. Like, I don't think we have any idea as to how much the current culture that we live in has been impacted positively by Christian standards. Like, the reason why we are so for human life and for equality and justice is because that's the Judeo-Christian belief that is permeated into society that we just now take for granted. It's absolutely Christianity's influence. And if you want to read more about that, you can look at Tom Holland's book on Dominion, who was a secular historian, and he starts to write about and research how Christianity started to transform Western culture, and he himself now identifies as a Christian. But you have to realize that in former times, in former places, and in the future, these cultural assumptions will not always be true, which does not make something like murder categorically horrendous. And if you want an example of that, case in point, let's jump back into our story of the Israelites that are journeying through the wilderness. What's the culture that they were just freed from by the hand of God? Under the hand of Pharaoh in Egypt, right? Where Pharaoh ran things. They came from a culture where he clearly did not value human life the way that God is saying that we should, that it's so self-evident to. In fact, Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites, treated them horribly. And if you read back into Exodus chapter 1, you actually read that Pharaoh decrees the death of every single Israelite baby boy. Why? Because he can. because he's the king. You see, without any kind of higher moral authority above Pharaoh, everything else about morality becomes an ought or a should. But it is not an obligation. It's all about whoever is in power. See, there's no true reason as to why murder is wrong. And that's not what we find in the Bible. The Bible grounds the Ten Commandments, it grounds moral order in God's authority himself, above and beyond any king or ruler or president. And this is what God says back in Genesis chapter 9 when he first talks about why you should not murder. He says this. He says, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. The Bible teaches that murder is wrong. Is wrong. Because every single human life is sacred. It has infinite value. Why? Because Scripture tells us that we are made in God's image. And that is the very thing that gives every single one of us, every single human life, dignity, honor, value, respect. And even the intuitions that we have as to why we think murder is so wrong comes from this sense that we are uniquely special in human life beyond the same thing as just being plants and animals. And that is because Scripture tells us God has invested his glory in you and me. See, naturalism, secularism basically says you're just matter. You're just a bag of bones. Therefore, you don't really matter. You can't really matter any more or any less than anything else, which makes it very, very hard, if you think about it, it makes it very hard to say murder is wrong, killing is wrong. But Christianity says you are an infinitely valuable image bearer of Christ. You reflect God's goodness, his holiness, his justice, his creativity. And you're made for a relation. You can have a relationship, a living relationship with God himself. That gives you immense value and worth because God gives you life as a gift. C.S. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity. Just warning you, this is going to be a heavy C.S. Lewis day, okay? He says this. He will make the feeblest and filthy of us into a god or goddess, a dazzling, radiant, immortal creature, pulsating all through with such energy and joy and wisdom and love as if we cannot imagine. A bright stainless mirror which reflects back to God perfectly, though of course on a smaller scale, his own boundless power and delight and goodness. This is what we believe deep down. And it's true because he has endowed us with his glory, with who he is. And that is why Genesis 9 says you're going to be held accountable for taking any kind of human life. Because he's saying you have no authority to destroy life. Life is ultimately a gift that God gives. It belongs to him. It is not your or mine to take. And so we are ultimately violating and stealing God's property when we kill or when we murder. That is why it is wrong. That's what the Bible teaches. A higher moral authority that makes it very, very clear. And you say, well, okay, well, that's great. I agree. But I've never violated this. And we'd be wrong. Just like all the other commandments, because here is how we now break this. That none of us are scot-free when it comes to this. One of the ways to understand the Ten Commandments is that there is this comprehensive nature to every single one of them. One of the ways to understand it is that each and every one of the commandments has an inside-out nature to every single one of the commandments. That is to say, the commandments are not just concerned with your outward behavior, but also your inward heart attitude. This is one of the things that separates God's law from any kind of human law. Human law can just sort of like regulate what you do or what you don't do. You can't get punished for what you're thinking or feeling. But God's law does. God's law has this inward-outward nature. It demands an inward integrity as well as an outward conformity. Here's what, this is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 related to this. It says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Jesus now is basically taking this idea, he is spiritualizing the law, and he's taking us deeper into the heart to show us the seeds of the heart that eventually sprout into action. Because he teaches that from the heart flows every evil deed, wickedness, malice, anger, deceit. And he says that anyone who is even angry at another brother or sister can be judged for this. And he's not talking about righteous anger. We see Jesus get angry. But he's talking about an unrighteous kind of anger that comes from our pride or our vanity or out of malice or deceit. That kind of anger, even that in your heart, can be judged. Or he says anyone who says Raka or calls somebody a fool, what is that? Raka is basically saying, you're nothing. You're not even a human being. You're beneath me. It is to look down on someone, to insult them. He says even that is subject to judgment. And you might be thinking, Jesus, that's harsh. Why is that the case? Well, let's think about this. How do you become a murderer? You wake up one day, you just be like Dexter. I haven't even watched Dexter. I don't know if that's what it's about. It first has to happen in your heart where you're sowing the seeds of anger and insult and contempt that then flow out into a kind of action. And we know what this is all about. We live in New York City. There's a lot of stress and pressures where our emotions and our feelings and our anger gets aroused all the time, right? Whether it's at a coworker, whether you're on your commute or someone online maybe. And it might just start with an annoyance, like they're just so annoying. And then over time, what does that do? It festers into a dislike. And then that dislike can ultimately end up into a kind of an anger toward them, where you start to see them in the worst light possible. In other words, you start to dehumanize them. They become a non-person to you instead of a holistic human being, until finally contempt gets breeded in our hearts. And here is what contempt is. It is a feeling that a person is beneath consideration, worthless, or deserving scorn. See, don't you see, the moment that you get there, you have already violated the image of God in that person. That is what Jesus is getting at. Our inward heart attitudes. And friends, here's the thing. In our world today, anger and contempt is encouraged. We live in a world full of outrage culture because we have all these moral convictions that we want to put on other people, and if they don't do that, we start to get outraged, and we don't realize how destructive this is in our current day and age. Here's a Dr. Brad Brenner who studied the psychology of outrage culture. He says this. This is a long quote, but follow with me here. He says, outrage is a multifaceted emotional response that intertwines anger, disgust, and moral indignation. It often arises from perceived injustices, moral violations, or threats to one's deeply held values and beliefs. And he goes on to say, research indicates that outrage is a highly contagious emotion capable of spreading rapidly through social networks. And in the digital age, social media has enabled communal outrage on an unprecedented scale, allowing people to broadcast their indignation and mobilize collective action across the globe. And when outrage becomes the dominant emotional response, it can foster what he calls a toxic outrage culture. This environment stifles open dialogue, reinforces echo chambers, and promotes polarization, intolerance, and even violence. He's saying it is becoming easier than ever to grow contempt, to dehumanize another person, especially online. And here is the scary thing. You think, well, I could never be a murderer. I could never do that. Here is the thing. We've never been in a time, in a place in our culture today where what is happening on the inside is more real than what's happening on the outside. The attitudes of our hearts are leading to actual violence on the streets. We don't have to scroll the news very far to see how much political violence there is on the streets. Why is that? Because contempt has been breeding in our hearts. And we say that's a good thing. You should stand up for what you believe in. But what does that lead to? Actual murder, actual killing. The taking of an image of God that is not yours to take. We think we're incapable. But we are all heading into dangerous territory as a society if we are unaware of how much we violate this command in our hearts, especially towards those that we deem our enemies. That's what Jesus is saying. There is this inside-out nature, but it's not just that. And I'm sorry, friends, I wish I could end it here, but there's even more as to how we break this. Because there isn't just an inside-out nature of this command. All the commands also have a positive and negative nature of every single command. Where one sin is forbidden, there is also a corresponding positive duty that is required. So in this instance, the vice that is forbidden is what? Murder. But the virtue that is meant to be cultivated instead in the positive sense is to preserve and promote life. That is why the law is so comprehensive. It is not just about harming or violating somebody's image, but it is also about promoting life in the love of Christ for the sake of your neighbor. That it's not just about, well, I'm neutral, I don't do no harm, so I must be free here. No, we break this if we don't also positively love for the good of others the way that God calls us to love our neighbors. And Martin Luther, the great reformer, he talks about basically how it's not just about killing another person, even in your heart. He likens it, he brings up the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you're familiar with that, somebody gets beat up on the side of the road, and the people that should help them just walk on by because they protect themselves, even the pastor, until his sworn enemy, a Samaritan, comes by, sees them in need, and actually risks their life, gives of their life, and to help them. And Martin Luther says, we break this commandment if we are not living that way, if we just pass other people by, if we're not trying to promote and preserve the good of other people around us. And why is that? Because here's another C.S. Lewis quote. Because of the weight of glory in people. Here's what he says. The load or the weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as now you meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or the other of these destinations. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. That is why the command is not just to not do harm, but to move positively toward them, to promote people's good. And the question for us is, are you stewarding the weight of glory of the people around you? When you spend time with the folks around you, in any setting here in this city, are you cold to them or are you honoring to them? It's not just feeling a contempt or an anger, but do you love and do you honor? Do you walk around and do people feel like they matter when they hang out with you? Are you busy tearing people down? Or are you actually building people up in love? Or in other words, very simply, are you loving your neighbor as yourself? Because that is what is honoring God's image in them, particularly Jesus' image in them, which is why he says in Scripture that the things that you've done to the least of these, and feeding the poor and clothing the hungry, feeding the hungry, you've done to me. Why? Because my image is in them. See, you thought you were safe. You thought you kept this command. We think that we keep this command. But when you understand the comprehensive nature of the law, it actually shows us that it is that much harder actually to keep. And you probably walked in here thinking, I'd never be guilty of murder. And yet here we are. And in fact, friends, here's the ironic thing about Christianity. The more that you grow in your Christian formation, in your spiritual maturity, the more you will actually see that the distinction between you and someone who outwardly breaks all of the 10 Commandments, including something like murder, that you're not so different from them. Because you can start to see the seeds of contempt, of pride, of vanity in our own hearts that could easily lead to those things if it gets cultivated. See, we're guilty, and that creates a real problem. Because a few minutes ago, we would have all agreed that this is a heinous thing to do. We would have all agreed that the punishment should fit the crime, that shedding blood, that spilling blood is a serious matter, and that we just agree with Jesus that life is of infinite value. But Jesus says that even your anger, even your ill will, your contempt toward another image bearer is killing the image of God in them, in your heart, which is why in 1 John, he says, anyone who is angry or hates his brother is a murderer. Friends, it is clear that we are all guilty. I'm sorry, but we are all guilty of shedding blood. So where does that leave us? We don't keep this command. I'm not even sure we can imagine someone who does. But friends, the good news this morning is that there is. There is someone who does, who perfectly keeps this command. And of course, that's Jesus Christ. And when he keeps this command, and the way that he keeps this command is also how he saves us, who should be punished, who should be judged for our shedding of the blood. And only if we see how he's kept this on our behalf can we actually keep this ourselves. Because here's the thing. Do you realize that when we disregard the image of God in the people around us, do you know what we're ultimately doing? We are ultimately dishonoring God himself. We're dishonoring Jesus himself. That is who we are responsible to. That is a higher moral authority that is the reason why we shouldn't do that, which means we have sinned directly against him, not just our neighbor or a friend in whom we've dehumanized. And the thing is, therefore, that means he has the actual authority to be angry, truly angry. He has the authority to take our lives because it was his life that he gave. And we violated him. He has absolutely the authority to be outraged, truly. But that's not what we see in Jesus. Instead, he never looks at us the way that we deserve to be looked at, the way that we should be treated. But instead, he continues to see us with this infinite value, precious in his sight, even though we were yet enemies of him, mocking him, and ruining and defacing the image of Christ in other people. And of course, he proves that to us on the cross once and for all. Where if you realize what is happening on the cross, friends, it is a mind-blowing and heart-exploding thing that the King of Glory, sheds his blood for the blood that we shed in others. And he shows us what it truly means to keep this command. Not just in the negative sense, but in the positive sense, by laying down his life for our good. A wretched sinner who deserves judgment, loving us with a love that we never deserved, so that he might restore his image in us, so that we can go out and love others into that image. You see, friends, that this is what we need in order to keep this command. We need to move the gospel, what Jesus has done for us on the cross, deeper and deeper into our hearts, because that is the only way it will stop us from growing contempt or looking down on others, because the gospel will inherently humble us. Because you know what it says when Jesus dies for us? It says that you think you're great, but you're not. In fact, you're worse than you can imagine. You're so bad that the God of the universe, the King of Glory, had to die for you to pay for your infinite debt. How dare you look down on anybody else? But at the same time, the gospel says, But you are also so loved and valued that the God of the universe, the weight of glory that infinitely outweighs any of our glories, would come and die for you, who deserves judgment. And when you understand that, when that becomes real to us, how he has been for our good, then we will have the power to go out and to love. Then we will go out to have the power to forgive those who have wronged us, and to not live with contempt, and to not look down on other people. But we will have the power to love and be for their good, to steward the weight of glory in them as we live out what Christ has done for you and I. Friends, this is the only way, if we see him laying down his life for us, that we can go and lay it down for others.